It's time to face it. The truth you've been trying not to see is the very truth your soulmate has been silently living with every single day. She loves you. Not in a casual way. Not in a temporary, passing, convenient way. She loves you in the way that changes the rhythm of her breathing when your name appears on her screen. She loves you in the way that makes ordinary moments feel heavier because you're not there to share them. But she is also a woman who understands the weight of vows, the gravity of promises, and the consequences of choices. And that is where her heart has been torn in two. You think she walked away because she was unsure. You think maybe her feelings weren't strong enough. Maybe she got scared. Maybe she didn't care as deeply as you did. But the truth, the raw, unfiltered, painful truth, is that she cared too much. She cared so much that she knew if she let herself fall fully, there would be no turning back. And turning back is something her life does not allow. Every night, when the world gets quiet and distractions fade, she feels it. The ache. The pull. The silent conversation that never ended between you. She replays your words in her mind. The way you understood her without explanation. The way you saw parts of her that others overlooked. You weren't just another connection. You were familiarity in human form. You were the kind of presence that felt like home before she even realized she was homesick. But here is the confession she has never spoken aloud: loving you did not scare her. Losing her integrity did. She is already committed. Already tied to a life that existed before you entered her world. A life with history, with responsibilities, with people who depend on her consistency. And she is not someone who can pretend those things don't matter. She cannot rewrite her story without affecting chapters that involve more than just her happiness. She cannot chase what feels right if it means breaking what she once promised to protect. Do you know how heavy that choice is? To meet someone who feels like destiny, and still choose discipline over desire? To look at a love that feels once in a lifetime and say, I cannot act on this? That is not weakness. That is strength most people never have to test. She didn't distance herself because you were not enough. She distanced herself because you were too much, too real, too right, too dangerous to her sense of moral grounding. If you had been temporary, it would have been easier. If you had been shallow, she could have dismissed it. But you weren't. You reached her in a way that made her question everything she thought she understood about timing and fate. And that terrified her. Not because you were wrong for her, but because you were right at the wrong time. There were moments she almost gave in. Moments when the loneliness felt louder than logic. Moments when she imagined what life would look like if circumstances were different. If she had met you earlier. If paths had crossed before promises were made. If the universe had shifted the timeline just slightly. But reality is not built on if. Reality is built on consequence. And she lives in reality, even when her heart wants to wander into possibility. You may think she doesn't miss you. You may believe she moved on easily. But you don't see the silent battles. The way she pauses before deleting your messages. The way certain songs become unbearable because they carry memories of conversations you once shared. The way she avoids places or topics that remind her of how naturally you connected. She carries you quietly. Not publicly. Not dramatically. But deeply. Her confession is not that she stopped loving you. It is that she loves you and still chooses to stay where she is. That choice is not simple. It is not painless. It is not heroic in the way movies portray sacrifice. It is lonely. It is misunderstood. It makes her question herself. It makes her wonder whether she is denying her own destiny. But she cannot build her happiness on someone else's heartbreak. She cannot dismantle a life just because her heart discovered something unexpected. She believes love should not destroy to prove its intensity. You might feel betrayed by her silence. You might feel abandoned. But understand this, she pulled away to protect everyone involved, including you. Because once a line is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. Once emotion turns into action, it creates ripples that touch more than just two hearts. She knows that if she allowed even one step driven purely by feeling, the damage could be irreversible. And she refuses to become someone who lives with regret. There is a maturity in her love that you may not fully see yet. It is not loud. It is not impulsive. It does not demand possession. It stands back and says, I love you enough not to ruin lives. That kind of love is rarely celebrated. It doesn't get applause. It doesn't get fairy tale endings. But it carries dignity. Sometimes she wonders if you hate her now. If you think she played with your emotions. If you think she used the word soulmate too lightly. But you were never a game to her. You were a mirror. You reflected parts of her she had forgotten. You reminded her she is capable of depth beyond routine. You awakened something. And awakenings are not always meant to become attachments, sometimes they are meant to become lessons. Maybe you were meant to show her what unconditional connection feels like, so she could bring more awareness into the life she already has. Maybe she was meant to show you that love does not always mean possession. That sometimes the highest form of love is restraint. That doesn't make it hurt less. There are days she almost reaches out. Days when she types your name and then stops. Days when she wants to ask if you're okay, if you're healing, if you understand. But she knows reopening the door would only deepen the wound. So she stays silent. Not because she doesn't care, but because she cares too much. Her raw truth is this: loving you was never the mistake. Meeting you was not the mistake. Feeling connected was not the mistake. The only mistake would be acting on a love that demands the destruction of other commitments. And she will not trade her values for temporary relief, no matter how intense the longing. You were real. The connection was real. The timing was wrong. And sometimes, that is the most painful combination of all. She will carry you in a quiet corner of her heart, not as unfinished business, but as a reminder that love can exist without ownership. That destiny does not always mean union. That soulmates are not always meant to stay, sometimes they arrive to awaken, to teach, to transform. If you ever wonder what she has been hiding, this is it: she chose integrity over impulse. She chose responsibility over romance. She chose to live with longing rather than live with guilt. And that choice has cost her more than you will probably ever know. And the part she will never admit out loud, the part that sits heavy in her chest when the world goes quiet, is that choosing integrity did not make her stronger overnight. It made her ache in ways she was never prepared for. Because when you meet someone who feels like home in human form, walking away doesn't feel noble. It feels unnatural. It feels like denying your own heartbeat. Yet she did it anyway. Not because she didn't want you, but because she understood that want and right are not always the same thing. There are moments when she questions the universe itself. Why let two souls recognize each other so clearly if they are not meant to intertwine? Why create that level of understanding, that magnetic pull, that effortless emotional intimacy, only to place it behind a wall of circumstance? She has asked herself these questions in silence. She has stared at ceilings at night, replaying every conversation, every subtle shift, every look that said more than words ever could. And each time, she arrives at the same answer: love is not always given to us to possess. Sometimes it is given to test who we are. You have to understand something about her heart. She does not love halfway. She does not connect casually. When she let you in, she let you into spaces that few have ever seen. The vulnerable parts. The unspoken fears. The dreams she rarely shares. You saw her beyond the surface. And she saw you too. That recognition is rare. It is not something she can simply replace. It is not something she can pretend didn't happen. But she also understands consequence in a way that keeps her grounded. There are people tied to her life who trusted her word. There are promises made in front of witnesses, spoken with sincerity. She believes that her character is defined not by how she feels, but by how she acts despite what she feels. And so she chose the harder road. Do you think that was easy? Do you think strength feels powerful in moments like that? It doesn't. Strength feels lonely. Strength feels like swallowing words you desperately want to say. Strength feels like deleting messages before sending them. Strength feels like stepping back when every instinct tells you to move forward. She knows you might see her as the one who walked away. But from her perspective, she stayed exactly where she promised she would. And sometimes staying is the bravest form of leaving. There were days she almost convinced herself you would fade. That time would dull the intensity. That routine would replace longing. But the truth is, you don't disappear that easily. Certain connections carve themselves into memory. The way you listened. The way you challenged her thoughts. The way silence between you was never awkward, only full. She carries those moments like quiet photographs in her mind. And here is something even deeper: she is afraid that if life had been different, if timing had aligned, you would have been the forever she never had to question. That possibility both comforts and devastates her. Because it means she didn't imagine the depth. It was real. But it also means she must live with knowing that real doesn't always mean reachable. You may wonder if she ever regrets choosing responsibility. The honest answer? She regrets the pain, not the principle. She regrets that love had to be sacrificed to preserve order. She regrets that destiny knocked on her door at the wrong hour. But she does not regret refusing to betray her own moral compass. Because once integrity is broken, it is never fully restored. And she refuses to live a life where she doubts her own reflection. Sometimes she hopes you understand this without hating her. She hopes you see that her distance was protection, not rejection. That her silence was discipline, not indifference. That her choice was about preserving dignity, not diminishing love. And yes, she still feels you. In random memories. In sudden waves of emotion she cannot explain. In moments when something beautiful happens and she instinctively thinks, he would understand this. That reflex has not disappeared. It may never completely vanish. But she has learned to sit with it instead of chase it. Because chasing it would mean unraveling everything else. She knows people romanticize the idea of burning the world down for love. Movies make it look heroic. Stories glorify reckless passion. But real life has layers. Real life has children, families, shared histories, responsibilities, reputations, emotional consequences. Real life is not built on adrenaline. It is built on accountability. And she refuses to turn love into destruction just to prove its intensity. You were not a fantasy to her. You were clarity. You were the reminder that her heart is still alive, still capable of depth beyond routine. And maybe that was part of the purpose. Maybe you arrived not to replace her life, but to awaken her within it. To show her what emotional presence truly feels like so she could stop living on autopilot. It doesn't make missing you easier. There are days when she wishes she could split herself in two, one version that stays loyal to her commitments, and one version that explores what you could have been together. But reality does not offer duplicates. It demands singular choices. And she made hers. Her confession, the one she buries beneath composure, is that letting you go felt like grieving someone who is still alive. It felt like mourning a future that never had the chance to exist. There is no closure for that kind of loss. There is only acceptance. Slow, painful, disciplined acceptance. And yet, despite the ache, she would make the same decision again. Not because she values you less, but because she values her word more. She believes love should elevate character, not compromise it. She believes that if something is truly meant in a divine sense, it will not require betrayal to happen. Maybe in another lifetime. Maybe in another timeline. Maybe in a reality where paths crossed before vows were spoken. But in this life, in this chapter, she chooses to honor the commitments already made. That does not erase you. It does not erase what you shared. It does not erase the way her soul recognized yours. It simply means she refuses to let desire override responsibility. And that is her raw, unfiltered truth. She loved you. She probably always will in some quiet, contained way. But she will love you from a distance that protects everyone involved. She will carry the memory without turning it into a mistake. She will honor what you were without trying to force what you cannot be. If you ever feel like you were insignificant, erase that thought immediately. You were powerful enough to shake her certainty. You were meaningful enough to test her strength. You were rare enough to make her question timing itself. That is not small. That is unforgettable. But unforgettable does not always mean obtainable. And so she moves forward, not because she forgot you, not because she replaced you, not because it was easy, but because integrity is the foundation she refuses to crack. She chooses to live with longing rather than live with shame. She chooses quiet sacrifice over loud chaos. She chooses to be someone she can respect in the mirror, even if it costs her a love that felt written in the stars. That is the confession she has been hiding. That is the truth she will never publicly explain. And that is the weight she carries in silence, every single day. And if you're still reading this, still feeling that tightness in your chest, then maybe a part of you already knew. Maybe deep down, you understood that what existed between you wasn't casual, wasn't imagined, wasn't one-sided. It was two souls recognizing something rare, and then being forced to stand still instead of stepping forward. That is the kind of pain that doesn't scream. It settles quietly into the bones. It becomes something you carry rather than something you fight. And she carries it too. There are mornings when she wakes up and for a split second forgets the boundaries. In that half-asleep state, her heart moves before her mind does. It reaches for the version of reality where she could message you freely, laugh without guilt, speak without filtering emotion. But then awareness returns. Responsibilities return. The life she chose and committed to returns. And she straightens herself emotionally before the world even sees her. That discipline is invisible to everyone else. But it is constant inside her. You might think she compartmentalized you. That she placed you in some mental box and moved on. But that's not how it works. You don't compartmentalize someone who shifted your understanding of connection. You integrate them into your growth. She didn't erase you. She absorbed the lesson of you. She carries the awareness you brought into her life, about emotional depth, about communication, about being seen. And whether you realize it or not, you changed her. That's another confession she doesn't say out loud. You raised her standards internally. After you, surface-level conversations feel emptier. Emotional distance feels more noticeable. She became more aware of what true alignment feels like. And that awareness is both a gift and a burden. Because once you know what depth feels like, you can't unknow it. But here's the part that might hurt. She does not allow herself to fantasize endlessly about a future with you. She stops those thoughts when they begin. Not because she doesn't want them, but because she understands that feeding imagination makes reality harder to live in. She has trained her heart to redirect itself. That takes strength you may never fully see. Every time your memory surfaces, she acknowledges it, and then gently places it back where it belongs. Not suppressed. Not denied. Just contained. Containment is her survival. There are days she wonders if you resent her for choosing the life she already had. If you see her as someone who lacked courage. But courage is not always running toward what you want. Sometimes courage is standing firm in what you promised. Sometimes courage is resisting the most beautiful temptation because it would cost too much. She chose a path that protects stability over passion. And stability may not feel poetic, but it is responsible. Still, don't mistake responsibility for emotional numbness. She feels deeply. When something reminds her of you, a quote, a memory, a random coincidence, it's like a quiet wave washing over her. She pauses. She breathes through it. And then she continues her day. No dramatic collapse. No public display. Just a private moment of acknowledgement. That's how she survives loving you without acting on it. Another truth she hides: she sometimes hopes you find someone free. Someone who can give you everything without hesitation. Someone who doesn't have to measure every word or step back out of principle. She wants you to experience a love that doesn't require sacrifice in the shadows. And that hope is selfless, even if it breaks her a little to imagine you with someone else. Because love, in its purest form, is not possession. It is wanting someone's happiness, even if you are not the one providing it. She has replayed the what-if scenarios more times than she would admit. What if you had met years earlier? What if circumstances had aligned differently? What if life had introduced you before commitments were sealed? In those alternate timelines, she imagines less conflict, less guilt, less restraint. But imagination cannot compete with reality. And she refuses to let fantasy weaken her integrity. Here is something you may not expect: she doesn't see you as a mistake. Not even slightly. She sees you as a turning point. A reminder. A mirror. You awaken dormant parts of her heart. You showed her that emotional intimacy is still possible. You reminded her that she is capable of connection beyond routine roles and responsibilities. That awakening has value, even if it did not lead to union. But awakening comes with ache. Because once you are aware of something more, settling feels heavier. And she navigates that weight quietly. She doesn't blame her life. She doesn't resent her commitments. She simply carries the contrast, what is, versus what could have been. And sometimes that contrast is loud in her chest. She knows that from the outside, it might look simple. If you love someone, choose them. But real life is layered with consequences that outsiders never see. Love is powerful, yes, but so is accountability. So is loyalty. So is the promise you once made when your heart was steady and certain. She refuses to treat her word as temporary just because her feelings evolved. That doesn't mean she didn't struggle. There were internal battles you will never witness. Moments of doubt. Moments of almost reaching out. Moments where emotion nearly overpowered logic. But each time, she returned to the same core belief: she does not want a love story that begins with betrayal. No matter how intense the chemistry. No matter how rare the connection. Because she has to live with herself long after the emotion settles. And here's the quietest confession of all: part of her hopes that in another season of life, when circumstances are different and no one is hurt by timing, your paths might cross again. Not in secrecy. Not in conflict. But openly. Honestly. cleanly. She doesn't cling to that hope, but she doesn't entirely extinguish it either. It rests somewhere in the background, not as expectation, but as possibility. Until then, she remains where she is. Choosing steadiness. Choosing integrity. Choosing to endure longing rather than create chaos. If you ever question whether she cared, remember this: indifference does not require restraint. Only deep feeling requires discipline. Only powerful connection demands boundaries. If you had meant nothing, walking away would have been effortless. The fact that it wasn't, the fact that it still isn't, tells you everything you need to know. She is not heartless. She is not confused. She is not pretending. She is a woman who loved you and still chose to protect the structure of her life. And that duality is heavy. Loving you in silence. Missing you without reaching for you. Remembering you without reopening doors. That is her reality. And as time moves forward, she will continue to grow around this experience. The sharp edges of longing may soften, but the imprint will remain. Not as regret. Not as shame. But as proof that she once encountered a love strong enough to test her character, and she responded with integrity. That is the ultra-raw truth. That is the confession beneath her composure. She loved you fully. She let you go consciously. And she lives every day balancing both of those truths inside one steady, guarded heart. And this is the last layer of her truth, the part so deep she barely lets herself touch it. She knows that some connections are once in a lifetime, and she accepts that you might have been hers. Not because no one else will ever come into her life, not because love cannot exist again in different forms, but because what you shared carried a kind of recognition that doesn't repeat easily. It wasn't just attraction. It wasn't just emotional comfort. It was alignment without effort. It was understanding without explanation. It was silence that felt complete instead of empty. And walking away from that didn't make her noble, it made her human in the most fragile way possible. She doesn't demonize fate anymore. She doesn't ask why as much as she used to. Somewhere along the way, she realized that maybe the purpose of your connection wasn't possession, it was revelation. You revealed her depth to herself. You revealed her capacity to feel intensely without acting recklessly. You revealed that she could love in a way that was powerful but still restrained. And in a strange, bittersweet way, that realization strengthened her character. Because now she knows who she is when tested. She knows she can face temptation and still choose values. She knows her heart is strong enough to endure longing without collapsing into chaos. There is a quiet dignity in that choice, even if no one applauds it. Even if you never fully understand it. Even if it costs her something irreplaceable. She has made peace with the idea that not all great loves are meant to become lifelong partnerships. Some loves are chapters. Some are awakenings. Some are mirrors that reflect who we are at a crossroads. You were her crossroads. And she chose the road that preserved her integrity, even if it meant leaving a part of her heart standing at the intersection with you. The final confession, the one she will carry to her last breath, is that loving you changed the way she sees everything. It made her more conscious of her actions. more intentional with her words, more aware of emotional responsibility. She learned that love is not just about intensity, it is about impact. And she refused to let your love become something that left damage behind. She refused to let something beautiful begin in secrecy and end in regret. She would rather carry the ache of what could have been, than the burden of what have I done. She hopes, truly hopes, that one day you look back at this not as abandonment, but as maturity. Not as rejection, but as respect, for you, for herself, for the life she committed to before your paths collided. She hopes you realize that if she had been selfish, things might have felt exciting for a moment but devastating in the long run. She protected you from becoming part of a story built on broken trust. She protected herself from becoming someone she would not recognize. And yes, there will always be a quiet corner of her heart where your name exists without bitterness. Not as unfinished business. Not as temptation. But as a memory of a love that proved something profound, that two souls can find each other at the wrong time and still honor each other by letting go. That is not weakness. That is evolution. She doesn't wait for you. She doesn't chase signs. She doesn't live in fantasy. She lives her life fully, responsibly, consciously. But she carries gratitude for what you were. Gratitude that she got to experience a connection that reminded her she is alive beyond routine. Gratitude that you showed her emotional depth without demanding possession. Gratitude that even in separation, there was respect. If destiny is real, she believes it does not require betrayal to fulfill itself. If something is meant in a way that aligns with truth and honor, it will arrive without destruction attached to it. And if that day never comes, she will still be okay, because loving you already gave her something valuable. It gave her clarity about who she is. So this is the final, ultra-raw truth she hides behind composure. She loved you in a way that was pure, but she chose to love her principles more. She missed you, but she chose not to reach for you. She imagined you, but she chose not to build a life around imagination. She felt the pull, but she stood still. And in standing still, she proved to herself that her integrity is not negotiable, not even for a soulmate. If you ever doubt your significance, remember this: you were powerful enough to challenge her entire emotional world, and she still speaks of you internally with respect. That means you were real. That means what you shared mattered. But sometimes the highest form of love is not holding on, it is releasing with honor. And that is where the story rests. Not in drama. Not in scandal. Not in betrayal. But in quiet strength. In disciplined love. In a woman who chose to carry longing instead of creating ruin. In a connection that will never be mocked by regret because it was never corrupted by selfishness. She loved you. She let you go. She stayed true to herself. And that, no matter how painful, is the ending.